Have you ever stopped to think that in the midst of the chaos of a war, silence can be more powerful than screaming? That's that. The Romans discovered this long before any modern strategy manual. While the enemies roared, slammed guns, and tried to win by shouting, the Roman soldiers marched in absolute silence with their eyes fixed in front and their bodies prepared to obey at the right time. But this was not coldness or arrogance. It was a choice. Silence was part of a larger, discipline. And for Rome, discipline was not just following orders, it was having self-control. It was knowing that even with your heart racing and tension in the air, you don't lose focus. You listen, observe, and act only when necessary. This attitude changed everything. It gave the Romans a brutal advantage on the battlefield. While the adversaries wasted energy trying to intimidate, the legions advanced with almost surgical precision. And look, this on a war field, where the slightest mistake can cost lives, made all the difference. They knew that those who talk too much or act on impulse expose themselves. Those who keep silent, on the other hand, observe more and surprise at the right moment. And so, step by step, Rome built one of the most respected and feared armies in all of ancient history. Wait a minute! Before I continue, I need your help. YouTube only releases this video to more people if it has a lot of interaction. That is, without your comment, this knowledge can be buried and never reach those who need it. If this content makes sense to you, comment If you disagree, comment 0 and tell me why. I want to see at least 100 comments here for YouTube to understand that this subject needs to be spread. Then comment now and be part of this mission to reveal the secrets of ancient Rome. Imagine being on a battlefield with thousands of soldiers, dust rising, enemies screaming, and arrows flying everywhere. Any sound can be lost in the middle of that chaos. Now, he thinks about trying to give an order there, shouting. Result? Nobody listens to anything. The Romans knew this, so instead of relying on the voice, they created a communication system that didn't rely on screaming. It depended on intelligence. They used visual signals and specific instruments, such as the tuba, which was a straight trumpet, and the cornu, a kind of curved horn. Each sound had a clear meaning: to move forward, to retreat, to change formation. And the most incredible thing is that these sounds cut through the noise of the field like a blade. While the enemies were lost in their own turmoil, the Romans were guided by loud, clear, and coordinated. This strategy transformed the army into something almost mechanical, but in the best sense, a well-tuned machine, where each piece knew what to do and when to do it, without depending on the confusion of screams. This made the legions not only faster but also much more accurate. It was the kind of organization that could turn the tide of a war. Now imagine hundreds of soldiers advancing together, each holding their shield in such a coordinated way that they form a veritable carapace, like a giant metal turtle. That's what we're talking about when we mention the famous testudo formation. This tactic was a masterpiece of real-time human engineering. Shields covered the sides, front, and even the top of the soldiers, creating almost impenetrable protection against arrows, stones, and anything that came from above. But here's the most important detail. This only worked if everyone was perfectly in sync. A single soldier out of position, a wrong step, a distraction, and the barrier broke. And to maintain this precision, no noise, no disorder, they relied on visual and auditory cues and absolute silence to stay focused. While many armies acted in improvisation, the Romans moved like a living cog. Every step was calculated, every shield had its place. And the silence? It was the link that held everything together. Without it, it would be like trying to put together a puzzle blindfolded. Impossible. This formation is another example of how Rome bet on intelligence before brute force. The goal was not only to attack, but to protect himself wisely as he advanced. And that, in the end, is worth more than any battle cry. While Rome advanced with discipline and silence, many of its enemies did just the opposite. They used noise, as if it were an invisible weapon. And you know what? It worked sometimes. Peoples like the Greeks, for example, began the battle by shouting gods. It was as if they put faith and fear on the same field. Already the Gauls? These were a storm of noise. They roared, screamed, slammed guns against each other, all to cause panic even before the fight starts. And the Germans had their own technique. Baritus, a song that started low and grew until it became a collective roar, almost hypnotic. The goal was simple: to mess with the opponent's head, make the enemy tremble before raising the sword. These tactics had a real psychological impact. Imagine standing there waiting for combat and hearing hundreds of men howling like wild beasts, beating their chests, promising blood. It was not easy to keep calm. But that's where the genius of the Romans comes in. They knew that noise had power. They didn't underestimate that. But instead of reacting on impulse, they preferred to stay focused. They were quiet, motionless, cold, until the right time. It was like playing chess against someone who tries to distract you all the time, and even then, you don't take your eyes off the board. The Romans were masters of something that few people value enough: adaptability. They were not stubborn. If they realized that an enemy tactic worked, they did not hesitate to observe, understand, and use it to your advantage. Of course, silence was the hallmark of the legions, but in certain situations, using noise could also be a masterstroke, and they knew it. It was not a matter of pride, but of efficiency. The priority was to win, smartly, not to follow a fixed pattern. Want an example? Imagine a battlefield where the enemy already expects Roman silence. Suddenly they hear a fierce cry coming from the soldiers of Rome. This not only breaks the expectation, but also destabilizes the opponent's morale. It was like using the enemy's own psychological weapon against himself. In other words, Rome did not reject noise altogether. She just knew when to use it. And when I decided to use, it did damage. It was a feature kept up his sleeve, an asset activated at the most strategic moment. Nothing was done on impulse. Everything was designed to have maximum impact. This mentality shows why the Romans not only won battles but also conquered entire cultures. They observed, absorbed what worked and transformed it into something even more efficient, without losing what made them unique: the order, the structure, and the total mastery of the situation. If this content is making sense to you so far, do this. Give me a sign. Comment one below so I know you're with me on this journey. And remember, YouTube only spreads this knowledge if it has a lot of interaction. If you haven't commented yet, now is the time. I want to see this video full of opinion so that this topic continues to reach more people. There are moments in history when silence speaks louder than 1,000 screams. One such moment happened in 61 AD, when the Romans faced one of the greatest challenges in Britain, the rebellion led by Boudica, Queen of the Iceni. She gathered a crowd of angry British warriors, all determined to sweep the Romans away. And the strategy of the British was clear: noise, scream, fury. They advanced like a wild wave, trying to break the morale of the Roman troops in shouting, but the soldiers of Rome remained motionless, silent. Not a word. Only the sound of the wind, the armor adjusting, and the rustling of the capes. Can you imagine the psychological impact of this? It was like facing a wall, an army that does not respond, that is not shaken, that only observes. And then, at the exact right moment, when the enemies were in perfect range, the Romans broke the silence. They launched a powerful battle cry and then a coordinated rain of pilum. Those Roman spears designed to destroy shields and break lines. The impact was devastating. What was supposed to be a triumphant invasion by the British turned into a massacre. The calculated use of sound, released only when it could cause the greatest possible effect, became the final blow. It was silence, turning into a precision weapon. This battle is not only remembered for the Roman victory, but for its strategic coldness. While the world screamed, Rome listened. And when he spoke, no one forgot. Over the centuries, the Roman army ceased to be made up only of natives of Rome, or the Italian peninsula. As the empire expanded, soldiers began to come from all corners. distant provinces, border regions, even from peoples who had previously been Rome's sworn enemies. And that changed a lot. For example, Germanic soldiers began to be incorporated into the legions. Men who years before had shouted the baritus against the Romans now wore armor with the Roman eagle on their chests. They brought with them their own customs, beliefs, and sounds of war. But here's the key point. Rome didn't erase these cultures. She absorbed what was useful. If the German war chant worked to boost morale, then why not use it on the auxiliary troops? That's what they did. Silence had remained the soul of Roman discipline, but now it coexisted with strategically placed war cries, tribal chants, and even small tactical adaptations based on the tradition of these new recruits. Rome was not an empire of pure imposition. It was an empire of strategic absorption. He transformed what was strange into useful. And that kept the army strong, even with so many different backgrounds within the legions. This phase shows that Rome's success was not just in fighting, it was in knowing how to integrate. And that in itself is a lesson worth gold to this day. With the entry of new peoples into the Roman army, such as the Germans and other soldiers from the provinces, the battlefields began to take on different sounds. It was no longer just the cutting silence of the early days. Now there were tribal rhythms, war chants, and even coordinated shouts. But be careful, this didn't turn into a mess. The Roman commanders, who never left anything to chance, quickly realized these sounds had power. Not only did they raise the morale of the troops, but they also created a climate that could intimidate the enemy. And as good strategists, they did what they did best: organize chaos. No shouting randomly. Each sound had a time and place. War chants, such as baritus, were integrated into auxiliary units. This gave the soldiers energy without disturbing the clarity of the orders. They continued to use the instruments, the tuba, the hornus, and the visual signals, but now, with an emotional reinforcement coming from the voices. Think of it as an orchestra, each group with its own sound, but all following the general's baton. Silence continued to be the basis of discipline, but when it was useful, noise came in as part of the war music. This balance between reason and emotion, between discipline and collective vibration, meant that the Roman army did not lose its essence, even with so many mixed cultures. On the contrary, it made him stronger, more complete. In the midst of so many changes, innovations, and adaptations, one thing has remained firm as a rock: silence as the central weapon of Roman discipline. It wasn't just a tactical choice, it was a mindset. An invisible code that united all soldiers, no matter if they were Italian, African, Iberian, or Germanic. It was this silence that allowed for almost impossible maneuvers, precise formations, and a quick response, even in the face of chaos. While other armies spent energy trying to scare, the Romans invested in what mattered most: clarity and control. This control was not only in the body but in the mind. A soldier who knows how to wait, who does not react on impulse, who listens to the order and executes without hesitation, is worth 10 who fight without direction. And that's what made the legion so feared. This silence, which to many seemed strange, was actually an invisible shield. He protected the morale of the troops, avoided mistakes, prevented disorganization, and above all, kept focused. And staying focused in the midst of war is like seeing a fixed point in the middle of the storm. It was this way of fighting, contained, methodical, lethal, that guaranteed Rome victory in battles that seemed impossible. The enemy never knew what was coming. The silence made everything unpredictable, and this unpredictability, it was pure advantage. In the end, Rome's greatness did not come only from sharp swords, shining armor, or shouts of victory. It came from the intelligence of knowing when to speak, and especially when to be silent. While many armies relied on emotion to stay on their feet, Rome relied on reason. I knew that a scream can frighten for seconds, but discipline, that one does win entire battles, and that is why the Roman silence was not empty. He was charged with intent. It was the sound of preparation, confidence, and calm that precedes impact. It was as if each soldier said without saying anything, "Wait, our response will be at the right time." This balance between containment and action was what gave Rome not only victories, but the dominance of an empire that spanned centuries. And even when they adopted new tactics, even when they absorbed different cultures and sounds, the Romans never gave up what made them invincible: the order, the strategy, and the silence that only those who truly dominate can maintain. If this content made sense to you, leave the like right now. This helps the channel a lot to continue bringing stories like this. And don't leave just yet. Click on the next video that is appearing here on the screen and continue discovering the secrets that have made Rome a living legend. See you there.